Book 5, Salem, Safety Assured Leaving East of Medicetti, Chapter 32. This isn't Idemia coming, is it? The next morning, Perrin and Shem were in conversation about the routes through the mountains when they heard the loud knocking on the door downstairs. They ignored it, since Mari would answer it, but a moment later another knock came at Perrin's study door. "Come in," he called. The door swung open, and there stood a scout in his green and brown mottled clothing. Perrin and Shem looked at him in surprise. "Shem, General," the scout said hurriedly, "there's a problem at the glacial fort." "What kind of problem?" Perrin asked. "Two men in civilian clothing, but they've been identified as some of your former soldiers." "Who is it?" said Perrin. "We're pretty sure it's Lieutenants Raiden and Afra." "John?" Perrin gasped. They hadn't noticed Mari standing by the door until she spoke. "Afra? Perrin, what are you going to do?" He glanced at Shem. "I think we need to have a little talk with the lieutenants." The scout shook his head. "I don't think that's a good idea, sirs. I've been sent to find out which method you want us to use to distract them, not to invite them." "Think about it," General Shin said to the scout. "Why would they be here? They made it through the forest, I'm assuming?" "They reached the boulder field yesterday. Took them 4 days, though." "And then through the boulders?" "This morning, yes. Remarkably, they found one of the footpaths. They abandoned their horses at the boulders and now were slowly making their way to the canyon." Shem let out a low whistle. "Oh, that was too easy. I don't like it. Not one bit. We should have been warned earlier." "Agreed," Perrin said. "In fact, we'll create a set of banners just for that very eventuality. The next time someone even sets foot in the forest, I want to be notified immediately." "Yes, sir." The scout fidgeted. "We didn't think they'd make any real progress, and we thought we moved quickly." "Well, you did, just not quick enough for my tastes." "This isn't Idemia coming, is it?" Mari asked nervously. "What Guide Gleese was telling us about?" "No, not at all," Shem insisted. "We knew something like this could happen, someone getting lucky in the forest and the boulders. It's always been our belief that anyone who is brave enough to make it through the forest should be allowed to go untouched. But we will never let them get past the glacial fort." "Why?" Mari asked, panic rising in her voice. "What will your scouts do to them?" "Nothing," Perrin insisted, "because I will deal with this myself." The scout sighed. "Guide Gleese was afraid you'd feel that way. I spoke to him first." Perrin was already on his feet, reaching for his dark leather jacket that was slung over his chair. "He's also given me the authority to do whatever I see necessary to keep Salem secure," he said, putting on his jacket. "If these men are successful, so will be others, and then Salem's secret is out." "So what are you going to do?" Mari asked again. "I like John Afra," she reminded him. "I like him too," Perrin assured her. "I'm just going to wait for the Creator to inspire me." Mari sighed and looked at Shem. He shrugged at her. "Sounds like a plan to me." The scout exhaled. Half an hour later, General Shin, Assistant Zenas, and the scout were riding hard to the second resting station. There was an updated report from the glacial fort when they arrived. The lieutenants were making their way up the canyon very slowly, unable to recognize the faint paths created by Salemites. "That's good to know," Perrin said. "That means we have time." "To do what, General?" one of the scouts at the station asked. "We have ways of distracting, you know." "I want to see John. Somehow I feel it's important." "But that's not the way we—" The scout stopped when he saw Shem shaking his head. "Remember when I told you at one of our training sessions that Shins never do things like everyone else? This is one of those moments. It's usually just better to sit back and let them go." The scout turned to Perrin. "Orders then, General?" Perrin slowly grinned. "What are Salemites, or Garters, known best for doing?" The scouts looked at each other and shrugged. Perrin grinned wider. kidnapping. It was their 5th day, and John couldn't have been more astonished at their progress. They'd survived the forest. In fact, it wasn't that bad. Given enough time, John was sure he could probably decipher all the dangers and even find paths through the trees. What they didn't see, interestingly, were any garters. There was no evidence anywhere of the masses of men they saw the night the Shins disappeared. But then again, maybe there weren't masses of men. That was the story, but John already knew much of the story originated in the mind of Commandant Genève. Trying to remember what was the story and what was real was already becoming harder. He glanced up at the sky to see its color. It was mostly blue, but the white puffy clouds shouldn't be ignored. Staring up at the mountain filled John with new worry. It was massive, rocky, steep. He and Raiden had been trying for the past few hours to make their way up it. They struggled around rocks, slipped on gravel, and both had scrapes and scratches to prove it. "Are you sure this is the right direction?" John asked as Raiden slid down another steep patch. "No," Raiden snapped, brushing gravel off of him. "I don't know what might be the right direction for anything. I just know we have 3 more days of exploring before we can even think about returning. And do I need to remind you that we have yet to find evidence of anything?" He wiped his brown shirt and groaned in displeasure at seeing another small rip. John didn't dare admit that he'd forgotten about finding evidence. He was more worried about finding a safe way out of there. "I don't see another source of water except for that river down there." He felt he should point that out. "Our flasks can hold only enough for 1 day, and—" "Look," Raiden said, "unless you have something helpful to say, keep it to yourself. We're supposed to be—" What was that? John looked in the same direction as Raiden, but didn't see anything. "What am I looking for?" "A movement. Definitely a movement up there on that—" He didn't know how to refer to it. "That jumble of rocks." "Maybe deer?" John offered. "Seen their droppings. Wait, I see it too." It was a figure in dark clothing, but too far away to see clearly before it vanished behind a tall bush. Instinctively, the lieutenants crouched, trying to use scrubby oaks as flimsy shields. "Garter?" John whispered. "Finally?" "Maybe," Raiden said, his voice none too steady. Raiden's sudden attack of nerves made John feel better about his own. He swallowed down an anxious lump and watched the rocks for any movement. He thought he saw something, but it was gone again. "Over there, beside that boulder," he whispered to Raiden. "Something like a shadow moving." Raiden only nodded, his eyes scanning. In dreadful silence, the 2 lieutenants watched the slope above them, waiting for something to happen. A pebble tumbled down from somewhere far above. Both men watched it nervously, as if it would grow into a boulder by the time it reached them. But it stopped at the scrubby oak which poorly hid them, and a few more pebbles began to bounce down the slope. Then more, then larger rocks the size of fists rolled in their direction as if something had disturbed the terrain above, or was purposely rolling rocks their way. "Should we move?" John whispered in a worry. "Then we'll be seen," Raiden said. "It's better than dying in a rock slide." "True." The tumbling gravel turned into a full rock cascade, which made the decision for them. They dove to their left toward another cluster of trees and scrambled to the next meager shelter. Grabbing the trees to steady themselves, they panted to catch their breath. "See anything?" John gasped as he eyed the slope above them. Raiden peered back up the hill. "No, nothing." John shielded his eyes from the sun. "Maybe he left." "Or maybe he's right here," said a deep voice from the other side of the trees. Both lieutenants jumped in terror as the brush moved aside and a large man in black stepped through. Unexpectedly, he smiled at them. "Hello, men. You both look well. Sorry for what's about to happen to you." John would have cried out, "Colonel!" but then his head hurt. He smelled burlap. and the world went black. Yeah, he's starting to come around. John heard a voice in the haze of his headache. He was lying down somewhere, but couldn't yet focus. "Take it slowly, John," said someone familiar. "Whenever they planked me, I couldn't think clearly for several hours. You got hit pretty hard." The voice was too much for him to ignore. He struggled to sit up and rubbed his eyes. "Colonel! Colonel! It really is you!" Perrin chuckled and took another wet cloth to put it on John's head. "Yes, it really is me. Now, what did I say about taking it slowly?" "He's going down again," another familiar voice said as John's head swirled. "Lie back down, John, and we'll explain things to you." He looked to the other side and saw Shem Zenas sitting nearby. Instantly he recoiled. "You!" he started, but he was cut off. "Shem's not a betrayer, John," said Perrin. "He saved us. Don't believe the stories. None of them are true." "I know, sir," John said, trying again to sort all of the different versions he knew about the end of the shins, which, he was thrilled to realize now, was not the end. He started to nod, but regretted the movement as he gripped his head. "I saw you in the forest right before Thorn was struck by the lightning." "Is that why you're here?" Perrin asked. "Looking for me?" "Yes, sir. Sent by Thorn." "Oh, no," Shem sighed. "Thorn knows they're here. Perrin, that changes things." I know, but it's still salvageable." "What is, sir?" John asked, his eyes more clearly focusing on the colonel. He seemed different, and it took John a moment to realize why. His black and silver hair was much longer, and even curled slightly, and his clothes more casual. John glanced over at Zenas and noticed his light brown hair was also just as shaggy. John could tell he was in a building of some sort, with a high-pitched roof that reminded him of the tops of trees. He was on a narrow bed, not in a surgery, but something more rustic. He didn't even notice the door until he heard a voice come from behind it. "General, the other one is still out." Perrin turned to the man in green and brown clothing. "Thank you, Winter. Tell me as soon as he regains consciousness." "General?" John ventured. Perrin smiled easily and waved that off. "Just a title. Makes them feel better about things." "And who exactly is them?" John asked. Perrin pointed at him. "That's one of the answers you're looking for, isn't it?" John pushed himself up to a sitting position. "Sir, please know that I don't want to report anything back to Thorn. Spending my vacation weeks searching the forest for evidence of your death, or that of your daughters, wasn't my idea. Although what I found exceeded anything I could have imagined, and I must admit, I'm pretty glad I came." Perrin and Shem exchanged a complicated facial tic, and Perrin turned back to John. "I believe you, but we still have a big problem. You're going to have to report something back to Thorn, and Raiden's going to be waking up soon to find himself surrounded by guards. Somehow that's going to get back to the captain. Thorn's still only a captain, right?" John dared to smile. He was sure he would have made a major by now, but Commandant Genev is in charge of the fort. Perrin shuddered with Shem. "Ugh, Genev is commandant. Well, that can't be fun for anyone now, can it?" John's smile faded. "The whole world has changed. You wouldn't recognize it. But you're still alive." The urge to hug the colonel, the general, nearly overwhelmed him. Perrin must have seen that in his eyes. He reached over and squeezed his shoulder. "I've always felt badly about never saying a proper goodbye to you. I'm quite happy to see you again, John. I've been worried about you." "Really, sir?" He hoped the Colonel General didn't hear his voice quavering. "Of course. Of all my soldiers, you had the greatest potential. Even Mari saw that." John swallowed. "Your wife, sir, is she?" "Perfectly fine and healthy, John. So is my son, my son-in-law, my daughter, and my granddaughter." John's shoulders sagged in relief. "A granddaughter. Congratulations, sir." She's a lot like her grandfather, too, Shem said. Black curling hair, big brown eyes, and the loudest voice you've ever heard. Perrin glared good-naturedly at his friend, but added, "She's absolutely adorable. Yes, I admit it. I said adorable." "Sir," John said, "you should know that Captain Thorne was most anxious to receive news about your daughter. He was sure you abandoned her in the forest, or that she gave birth somewhere to a boy." He cringed, worried about the Colonel General's reaction, and decided not to tell him that Thorne thought it would be his son. "So that's what he's thinking?" Perrin scoffed. "We suspected he was after Jatesy, and probably my grandson, and then what?" John shrugged. "Sir, I'm not sure. He's given us 3 weeks to find proof of something, and we spent about 5 days so far." "So 2 more weeks, then, before he expects them back," Shem said, rubbing his smooth chin. "That gives us some time to come up with something." "Sirs, please, exactly where are we? And what happened that night in the forest last year?" Shem shook his head, but Perrin nodded. "No, Perrin," Shem said. "You can't explain it to him. He already knows more than he can handle. When he goes back, he'll never be able—" "That's why he's not going back, Shem," Perrin said steadily, looking John in the eyes. "He's staying here with us. There's nothing back in the world for him. Right, John? Aside from his bucket-living great-aunt who didn't recognize him?" "Well, not really." Shem stood up abruptly. "Perrin, I put up with this taking in the lieutenants just to appease you, but we can't keep them like kittens. If they don't return to Thorne—" "He'll assume they died in the forest," Perrin decided. "We'll take their clothes and tear them to shreds, sprinkle some deer blood on them, leave them somewhere obvious so the fort will discover them, and assume that a bear ate them." He grinned. "Worked for us." Shem threw his hands in the air. "But it didn't work, Perrin. It was a huge mess. And if Thorne's been holding on to whatever delusions he's imagining for this long, he'll keep trying to find Jatesy." Now Perrin stood up and put his hands on his waist. "How many people have you stolen out of the world over the past years?" Shem cocked his head toward Afra. "Why do you insist on exposing him to even more? What kind of danger are you trying to put him in? I've told you before, we limit knowledge to protect." "He's one of us, Shem. I'm not sending John back to that world. To Thorne? To Genève? What kind of existence is that? We snatched the worthy ones out of there. No one is more worthy than John Afra." John, fascinated by the argument overhead, blushed at the compliment. "I agree," Shem said loudly back. "But we can't be sure that—" "General," a voice interrupted the argument. The man called Winter said, "The other one is starting to come around. Do you want us to remove the bag from his head?" Perrin and Shem both sighed and looked apologetically at each other. "We'll finish this discussion later," Perrin nodded to his friend. Shem nodded back once, in private. Perrin turned to John. "What's Raiden hoping to accomplish?" "He was transferred to Scrub right after you died, after you vanished," John corrected himself. "He wants to get out of there. I think he's got some plans, but he hasn't shared them with me. Actually, he hasn't shared anything with me." "So he may have his own agenda and not just Lemuel's," Shem speculated. "Thorne's being undercut on every side, isn't he?" "Good," Perrin said with a cold smile. "But it sounds like Raiden wouldn't initially be too interested in staying with us, does it?" John shook his head. "No, but sir, I'll stay. I don't even know where I am, but anywhere with you, sirs, is better than the world." Perrin turned to Shem. "Now, how can we argue with that?" Shem rubbed his forehead for once. "Please, Perrin, let's deal with Raiden right now and leap over one canyon at a time." "Just relax here," Perrin said, putting his hand on John's shoulder and squeezing it. "We'll get back to you. If you need anything, just ask. Food, water, clean clothes. We can get you anything." John gripped the general's arm. Thank you, sir. I certainly have missed you. Perrin winked at him, and he and Shem slipped out the door. John sighed, sat back against the wooden wall, and closed his eyes in sheer contentment. Perrin headed for the reception area where Raiden was being held, but Shem caught his arm. No, he said. No what? Perrin asked. You're not going to see Raiden, not yet. But, look, Raiden's not John. When at any point of serving with Raiden, did you find him to not be an opportunistic and self-serving rat? Well, that's rather harsh. Well? Perrin shrugged. Never felt I could trust him further than I could throw him, he admitted. Exactly. Even John doesn't know why he's here. Shouldn't that give you cause for alarm? We need to find out his agenda first, before he even knows we're here. Perrin fidgeted. He may have already seen me, and heard me. Shem clenched his teeth before saying, You spoke to them before they were rendered unconscious? Perrin swallowed. All we can hope, Shem seethed quietly, is that Raiden won't remember. So stand back here where we can listen, and only listen, he emphasized. Raiden could tell his hands were bound with rope, even without seeing them. The old potato bag over his face prevented that. It was obvious what had happened. He and Afra had been captured by garters. His head pounded from the blow he'd received to knock him unconscious, and for all he knew, he'd been there for hours. He opened his eyes. Through the rough weave of the cloth, he could just make out a few shapes and light. It was still day, but the shadows around him suggested he was indoors, likely a secret camp. We know you're awake, said a harsh voice. Why are you here? I'm just looking, Raiden answered honestly. My friend and I were exploring, and we... Lies! The voice bellowed right in his ear. Raiden flinched as the word bounced around his aching head. No one explores. No one gets through the forest. How did you do that? It took us days, Raiden said. We moved carefully and slowly. We're just interested in exploring. We didn't intend to find any... Lies again! The voice screeched. How stupid do you think we are? I don't know, Raiden said. Stupid enough to bring me to your camp? He fully expected to be slapped or kicked for that answer, but instead he heard a low chuckle come from another part of the room. Good point, the voice said quietly. So that's how they were playing it, Raiden decided. Bad garter, good garter. They'd practiced something like that at the fort in Scrub, ever since the idiot commandant took over. The problem was no officer ever knew who was supposed to be good and who was supposed to be bad. Everyone wanted their chance to beat the villagers instead. How did you get through the boulder field? The first voice demanded in his ear. We found a path. Took us forever to get through, though. Kept getting lost, but we prevailed because we're explorers. Looking for what? I guess looking for you, Raiden said as casually as he could, squinting through the mesh to see his captors. He could almost discern the outline of his interrogator. Always wanted to know who might be up here guarding this land. It's enough, the voice from the corner said. Release him. Raiden felt the ropes being tied, and someone help him up, not unkindly. The cloth bag over his head was removed, and he found himself face to face with the little old man who grinned at him. Tell me I at least had you a little worried for a moment. Raiden blinked rapidly at the brightness around him. You're more fearsome in voice than in appearance, he said to the tiny grandfather. I know. Who are you people? Raiden demanded. Well, I tend to do the cooking, said the ancient man. So where the slag am I? Raiden noticed 4 more men, larger, younger, and stronger, dressed in green and brown mottled clothing, standing guard. In front of him stood a middle-aged man who said, Now, Lieutenant, we don't allow that kind of language here. This isn't a profane fort, but a sanctuary. You know who I am? Raiden swallowed. We do. My name is Winter, and you are Lieutenant Raiden. We know everyone in the world, he said smoothly. Now, why have you left that world? He didn't know how to respond as he stared up into 5 faces watching him closely. The little old man had shuffled off somewhere, and in the distance Raiden thought he heard pots clanking. Where's my companion? Raiden demanded. Here, Afra said, standing unsteadily at the door. Strangely, he seemed rather happy. Can you believe it? They actually exist! And who is they? Raiden asked sharply, glaring at his captors. Winter smiled vaguely. They are us. And you are now very far away from home. Would you be so kind as to tell us why you are here? He said it politely, but his eyes were cold and hard as he studied Raiden intently. Raiden's instinct was to shout and fight and thrash, but something else was tapping at the back of his head, an understanding that none of this was expected, none of this was right, and just what kind of promotion would Snide and Mal bestow upon the officer who discovered that, under the very nose of High General Thorne, the girders were again rising in power? Raiden knew they were waiting for an answer, and he frantically came up with one. You say you know who I am. Therefore you must also know about the world I've just left. Since Colonel Shin died, everything's fallen apart. I've tried to be a loyal officer, but I was in the forest that night the Shins were lost. I saw things that didn't quite seem right. He watched their eyes closely and thought he saw veiled approval and agreement. I need to know the truth, he told them, with as much sincerity as he could muster. And I'm willing to do anything to find out what really happened. Even if the truth is seemingly impossible to believe, I want to believe. The man called Winter, who hovered over him, relaxed slightly. Nice little speech there, Lieutenant Raiden. We'll see just how much you mean that. In the next room, Perrin elbowed Shem eagerly and started for the door, but Shem caught his arm and swung him back. Didn't you hear him? Perrin whispered urgently. He's willing to believe the impossible. Let's show him me, the impossible. Opportunistic, Shem reminded him. Self-serving. Raiden's going to say whatever he needs to say. He is not ready. Raiden tried to sit up, but Winter shook his head. You've been down for quite a while. Your body needs time to adjust from the effects of what we did to you. And what did you do to me? Raiden asked nervously. Winter smiled. Nothing lasting. You may, however, remember a few things strangely, so don't rely too much on your memories. What do you remember last, by the way? Raiden pondered. Rocks pouring down on him, then a man in black. He shrugged. Boys, Winter said to his guards, we need to show the lieutenants just where they are. If you would be so kind as to accompany each of them. Winter led the way out of the narrow building, and the guards stood on either side of Afra and Raiden as they followed him. But Raiden was plotting, thinking, and memorizing as much as he could. Remember everything? Remember everything? He blinked rapidly as they were led into the blinding sunshine. Shielding his eyes and ignoring the pounding headache, he stared in alarm at what he saw. On every side, mountain peaks jutted upwards, completely ringing him. The grasses he stood in were damp, and sections were still covered with snow. To his left he saw a large blue pool, similar to what dotted the landscape in Idemia and Pools, but no steam was rising off of it. Are we on top of the mountains? Raiden dared to ask. Yes. Ever been sedated before? He shook his head. Afra gasped. This is amazing! This is also, Winter told them, as their guards stood exceptionally close to the officers. Very far away from anywhere you know. We want you to realize that we will not keep you tied up, but you are essentially our prisoners. There's nowhere for you to go, so don't even bother, unless you wish to die. If the elements don't get you, the wolves will. However, Winter continued, his tone convivial, can you imagine a more beautiful place for your confinement? Raiden glanced at him. And for how long will we be confined here? Well, we're not too sure about that yet, Winter admitted. You see, our men in charge are still debating as to what to do with you. Seeing Raiden's worry, Winter added, your life is secure while you are with us. We don't want to harm you. Just do the best things for all involved. Raiden knew an ambiguous answer when he heard one. He was the king of them. So when do we meet these men in charge? The identity of the leader of the Garters, revealed to Snide, would undoubtedly propel Raiden past the promotion of Major. He just might be Lieutenant Colonel Raiden by the next moon. In time, Winter said easily. In time, I'm sure. Until then, the men in charge have tasks for you. Raiden tried to hold back his glower. No doubt he and Afra were about to do something menial, such as hammering apart some boulders around them. Do you boys enjoy reading? Winter asked. Excuse me? Afra chuckled. Sure do. What do we get to read, Mr. Winter? History, he said, the way we know it. You mean, Raiden blinked in surprise, we're going to do homework? Yes, Winter said, as he led them back to the strangest-looking building Raiden had ever seen. Remember that it looks like a grove of trees, he told himself. A grove of trees. Because, boys, Winter said, your education is just beginning. Later that night, as the lieutenants rested in nets in the sleeping quarters, Afra said, so that historian guy actually made it all the way over to the ruins, and he spent weeks there making rubbings of engravings and tracing pictures of strange animals and wandering around massive block buildings? King Quirrell the First soldiers were with him too? Wow, they never told us any of that in school. He chuckled ruefully. No, Raiden said shortly. They didn't. And that guy, Terrell, what was his name? Who wrote all those stories? Raiden sighed. Have to admit, seeing a book that's over 100 years old was pretty surprising. Elephants, Afra whispered. I remembered something about them when I was just a boy. Never told us in school, though. And those other animals. Those stories were pretty outrageous, Raiden hinted. But I think that was the point, Afra said, rolling over to see Raiden. Why they showed us that book? To show us what's real is different than what we've been taught? All that stuff is... He yawned. I'm too tired. Anyway, something like that. Yes, Raiden said slowly. Something like that. Still, making us draw pictures of those animals the book described, I felt like I was 6 years old again. Yeah, Afra said drowsily. That was kind of fun. To be treated like children, if you say so. I still want to meet the men in charge, who think we can't do anything more adult. Oh, we will. Afra's voice was drifting away. We will. Raiden stared up into the darkness as Afra began to snore lightly. That old historian's name was Terup, one of the many details Raiden recited to himself, to repeat at a later date. He'd taken a few notes, too, and secured them in his sock. There were a lot of things they'd never been told in school, at least according to Winter and the guards. Lots of things the world had decided to forget. Why? That was the question Winter told them to ponder tonight. Why did the world conveniently forget? But that wasn't the question Raiden was pondering. His mind was fixated instead on, who is lying, these Garters or the old kings? Who should he believe? These people who want to change everything he knew about the world? Or the world which will reward him handsomely for revealing that the Garters still exist? He didn't come up with an answer before he drifted off to sleep, where he dreamed about monkeys and elephants swinging and stomping around the big administrator's table in their headquarters in Idumea. Outside their door, Shem glared at Perrin. "Told you treating them like children would be demeaning," he whispered. "But John enjoyed it," Perrin defended. "And so did Raiden. He just won't admit it. You're the one who told me to take baby steps to get them ready for what we can offer." Shem groaned quietly. "Ugh. When I said baby steps, what I meant was... Oh, never mind. You'll do things your way no matter what I advise." "Tomorrow we'll graduate them up a bit," Perrin promised. "We'll implement some of the lessons your scouts teach people in the world about the quarrels and their true nature and guide packs." Shem eyed him. "Will you let Winter teach it as it should be taught?" "Of course," Perrin said. "And what if Raiden rejects it?" Perrin scoffed. "I was spying on them when they were drawing their pictures. You didn't see how much he got into sketching his monkeys." "Just because he likes the idea of monkeys doesn't mean he's going to believe and accept Salem. We don't even have monkeys." "It'll all work," Perrin whispered. "Just trust me." "You've never done this before. Trust me. We have years of experience." "But I know how my soldiers think, Shem," Perrin interrupted. "The entire reason for having an army is to keep people safe. If the world were safe, we'd all would have been out of a job. And frankly, I think most soldiers wish they were. They serve only because the world needed someone to do it. But deep down, we wish we could be something else, something more. I've always wanted to be a builder, you know that. And even though you were in the army for 17 years, I knew your heart wasn't entirely in it." Shem had to bob his head in reluctant agreement. "Those men want something more too," Perrin insisted. "They want meaning. They came here looking for something else. Well, I don't yet fully trust Raiden. I believe he's looking for something more than serving in scrub under Mal's commandants. Who really would want that?" "No one," Shem admitted. "Shem, I serve now as general because I believe in Salem and all that it represents. It's like I suddenly see dozens of new colors I never knew existed. I want to do that for these boys. Open their eyes, show them something fantastic. These young officers are struggling to figure out what they're supposed to be doing. Shem, those boys are me, 25 years ago. 25 long, miserable, bloody years. If I can spare them that existence and give them this life instead, then I'll do whatever it takes." Shem could do nothing more but sigh. In the morning, Raiden slipped out of his fishing net before Afra was awake and made his way to the eating table in the long room, because he'd woken up with a plan. Winter was already up, seated to breakfast. "Have a good night, Lieutenant?" he asked. Raiden hid his smile. He was hoping for an opportunity like this. "Actually, no, sir." He sat down across from Winter. "I had a hard time sleeping because my mind just couldn't relax." "Understandable. If you'd like, I've got a tea I can give you tonight to help with that." Raiden smiled. "That would be appreciated, thank you. But why I couldn't relax was that the world was too much on my mind. Now that I've got some distance away from it..." "Don't ask how far, don't ask how far," his brain reminded him. "I somehow feel it more, how terrible it is." He made sure to stare at his hands as he said that. "You told us to think about why the world decided to forget about Terep and the ruins and those strange animals, and I have to be honest, I don't know how to think about anything anymore. Does this make sense?" Winter nodded sadly. "Perfect sense. You may not realize this, but I used to be in the world. I know a lot of how it works, and I've heard a great deal about how it is now. I'm sorry you've had to be a part of it." Raiden wanted to shout, "How do you know how bad it is?" But he had to play this smart. "I was up most of the night with the idea of different places, different stories, even a different life," Raiden said. allowing for a little tremor in his voice. "Like you gentlemen have here. If I could escape the world and maybe find ways to help it." He shifted his focus on Winter and thought, open and honest, open and honest. That was what he wanted the scout to see, even though Raiden was fishing recklessly and wildly, worried that he'd scare away the trout. But the big catch across from him wasn't wary. In fact, he was smiling faintly. "That's what we want for you as well, Raiden. But there's a lot you have to learn first." "That's what I want," Raiden said earnestly. "I want you to teach me everything. And, sir," he paused for dramatic effect, "this sounds outlandish, but, oh, never mind. I shouldn't have said anything." "No, please, go ahead. You can't surprise me." Raiden offered him a weak smile. "But I don't want to offend." Winter smiled generously. "You can't do that either. Please, what do you want to say?" He braced himself, and not quite looking Winter in the eyes, said, "Despite my best efforts, I find myself trusting you. Not the others just yet, but there's something about you that I just feel. This is embarrassing, but in a way, you remind me of my uncle." "Oh, I'm sure I'm blushing right now." Winter chuckled. "Not at all. I'm quite flattered." Ease up, Raiden told himself. "I shouldn't have said that. I'm sorry, but I'm glad I met you. No matter what happens to me," he looked up and met Winter's eyes with a gaze that pinned the man like a butterfly on display. "I'm glad I met you." Winter leaned back. "I'm glad I met you too, Raiden." On his way to relieve himself in the washing room, with Winter following his prisoner, Raiden smiled internally. One thing he'd learned from Lemuel Thorne in the time the captain was trying to impress the colonel was that older men don't want to be impressed. They see that as threatening, as self-serving, as one-upmanship. What older men want, Raiden knew, was to be flattered, to be idolized by the younger generation. It worked on General Snide, it worked on his commandant and scrub, and it was working on this middle-aged man whistling a happy ditty as he stood on guard outside of the door. The first words Mari wanted to blurt were, "He just got back from 5 days in the mountains," but she held it in as Shem gave her the news. Instead, she just whimpered, "Weeks?" Shem sighed. "He thinks in about 4 weeks both of them will be ready to join Salem. He doesn't feel he should leave them during their transition time. While John knows he's there, Raiden still doesn't. Until we know his intentions better, Perrin and I will stay in hiding." "But this isn't the way people are normally taught about Salem, is it?" Calla asked, her arms still around her husband. She had come back from Norden yesterday, surprised to find her husband was now at the glacial fort. Mari had invited her over for breakfast, and they were commiserating about being husbandless when Shem arrived. Mari tried not to watch them, but she couldn't help it. Shem and Calla seemed to forget they were still clinging to each other in an awkward embrace, trying to keep her belly to the side. They talked easily with Mari as if hugging was a normal part of every conversation. Shem stroked his wife's black hair. "No, this isn't the way it's done," he said, irritated. "I spoke to Guide Gleese before I came here, and he just sighed and said, 'They're Perrin's men, let Perrin deal with them. We're worried this won't end well.'" Mari nodded sadly. "John is a possibility, but Raiden, he can't be kept here against his will." "We tried that once with Wallachia," Shem reminded her. To Calla, he said, "That was the Garter lieutenant sent to Edge years ago. He was supposed to eliminate Jatsi Pato and even Heiseman Pato, one at a time, to slowly destroy Perrin. He really believed he was on a noble errand. But I kidnapped him away, and we changed his name to Lakaya, and changed his mind, too, or so we thought. He managed to stay here a few years, but something inside him snapped and he took off. Those early Garters took their oaths very seriously, and he was the only one who didn't commit suicide when he was captured. Still, he died, we assume, by his own doing. I'm worried that Raiden will be as unstable, but Perrin isn't." Mari squinted. "Why? Perrin's pretty perceptive about people. You don't think he'll see?" Shem was shaking his head. "This morning Raiden spoke to Winter, seemingly intent and excited about learning what we have to offer." "And you are skeptical," Mari guessed. "To put it mildly, but Perrin's convinced, and because Perrin's convinced, so is Winter and everyone else." Shem sighed in aggravation. "Winter and the others are good, solid men, but they haven't been in the world recently. Nor were they there as long as I was. I know the world. They're only slightly acquainted with it." "If Guy Gleese heard you," Mari began, "he'd be calling you his cynical duck." "Someone has to be cynical," Shem groused. Calla regarded him uncertainly, never before seeing him this irritated. She did the best thing she could to help him and leaned her head against his chest. "I'm going to miss you." He kissed the top of her head. "I'm coming home again tonight and every night, because why would I want to sleep in the nets when I could be with you in—" "Ahem!" Mari cleared her throat loudly to remind Shem she was still in the room. He glanced sheepishly at her and nodded once. "Now," he rubbed his wife's belly, "should something happen with you—" "Don't worry, still about 7 more weeks. And I've got company," Calla tried to say brightly. "Lilla is staying." Shem's eyebrows went up. "Really?" "Papa was up early this morning, ready to head north, but Lilla begged to stay. He reminded her that she was supposed to go on that big youth trip to Terrap's Land in a few days." "Everyone gets to go but me," Mari murmured. "And Lilla said she could just go up with our group here and meet up with the Norden one along the way." Shem squinted. "Your father agreed to that?" "She wasn't the only one petitioning," Mari said with a smirk. "My son was right by her side, assuring Mr. Travato that he would personally watch out for her." For the first time, Shem began to smile. "Oh, really? And where are they now?" Calla and Mari exchanged the same look. "We don't know," Calla admitted. "Yes," Mari said heavily. "Mr. Travato gave his permission. Pato grabbed Lilla's hand and said, 'Thanks, Mr. Travato. Lilla, I want to show you something.' And the next thing we know, they're out the door. They didn't even have breakfast, which for Pato is rather alarming." She folded her arms. Shem chuckled. "Well, remember, Mari, Salem's a safe place." "Oh, it's not Salem I'm worried about." "Mari, Pato is an exceptional young man." Shem started but was cut off. "Who was raised in the world, Shem. Yes, Perrin and I made it clear to him what we expect, but the world was also just as direct in demonstrating how young men can treat young women. I was counting on Perrin to come home and give my son some unforgettable reminders." Calla patted Mari's shoulder. "That's why I'm here," she said. As calm and gentle as Calla was, there was a firmness in her eyes that assured Mari she knew how to speak to young men as well as Mari. "Thanks, Calla. I suppose between the two of us trying to keep track of them, we should have enough entertainment while our husbands are living in the mountains." Shem nodded. Perrin wanted a few changes of clothes, if you wouldn't mind." She winked at Shem and Calla. "May take me at least 10 minutes to gather his things," she hinted. "I'll be upstairs." She gave them 15 minutes before creeping quietly down the stairs. She couldn't help but watch them again, kissing tenderly in her gathering room, Shem's hand remaining on the bump that was his baby. It was probably a good thing Perrin wasn't there to see them, or he'd be in a permanent cringe by now. Mari coughed politely and continued more noisily down the stairs, with Perrin's clothes in a bag, but the Zenuses remained locked in each other's arms. It was the rapid pounding on the front door that finally broke them apart. Mari opened it to see a scout in model clothing. "Is Assistant Zenas here, Mrs. Shen?" "He is." She gestured for the scout to come in. "He's just explaining the situation to us." She glanced at Calla, who blushed as she untangled herself from her husband. Shem grinned out of sheer embarrassment. The scout tactfully remained on the front porch. "Sir, we're ready to leave whenever you are," he called. "I'll be out in a couple of minutes," Shem told him. The scout headed back to his horse while Shem sighed at his wife. "Remember, should anything happen while I'm away, you can send Pato or Lilla. No, you probably can't. You can send one of my more reliable nephews to the scouts, and they can come get me. Within a few hours, I'll be here." "I know," she smiled bravely. "I always wondered what it would be like being married to someone in the army. I guess I'm getting a little taste of that now. I only wish I could watch you." "No!" Shem said loudly, causing his wife to jump. "Sorry, but Calla, I want to keep you as far away from the world as possible. I wish it wasn't as close as the canyon behind us, and I really wish it wasn't dragging me away from you right now. I never want you to be exposed to any of it." "Not even to see the sergeant major in action?" "Especially not." "I'll keep a close eye on her, Shem," Maury promised. "She'll be fine." Calla smiled at her husband. "Go, Shemmy," she whispered. "You have a long ride ahead of you, and I need to put away all the baby things my mother sent with me." Shem ran his fingers through her hair one more time. "All right, my love. I'll be back tonight. I'm sorry to leave you." "Remember, it's Perrin's fault," Maury told them. The Zenuses shared one last kiss, and Shem patted Maury gratefully on the back as she handed him Perrin's pack of clothes. The two women stood on the front porch watching as Shem and the scout rode off. Maury put her arm around Calla. "Sorry that my husband is taking away yours." "It's all right, Maury. I have a feeling this won't be the last time Shem—" "You mean Shemmy?" Calla went pink. "That my husband will be needed by someone else." Calla was fine, right? Perrin stood smugly in front of the stable doors at the glacial fort, his arms folded. "Just as I said, right? And she had a wonderful time in Norden and brought home plenty of baby things to put away." Shem glowered at Perrin and threw his pack at him. It smacked him in the face, but not hard enough to wipe off his smirk. "Not too happy about things, though," said Shem as he dismounted. "I think it's you who's not too happy about things." Perrin smiled slyly, shouldering his pack. "I keep telling you, it's good for your wife to miss you a bit. Makes the reunions that much sweeter." "I'm going back tonight," Shem growled. "I'm not spending another night in the nets." "I figured as much," Perrin chuckled. "The lieutenants are reading some of the early histories right now, and they'll make a list of what's different from what they've been taught." "And I'm sure they're thrilled to be up here in the middle of nowhere doing homework," Shem snapped as he marched into the stables, where he and Perrin had been hiding. Insulted, Perrin jogged to catch up. "Hey, I thought it was a good idea. So did the scouts." "That's because they're loyal to a fault," Shem said under his breath. "What did," Perrin hesitated, "what did Guide Gleese think of my plan?" Shem rounded on him. "Again, not too happy about things. But he said they're your former men, so if you insist on being responsible with what happens to them, he will let you. He's planning to come up here, though, to see what you're up to, but his schedule's not clear until next week." Perrin nodded in what he hoped was a conciliatory manner. "I'll make him proud of me, I promise, just like I promised you." "It's not up to you, Perrin," Shem gestured wildly. "Why can't you recognize that? You can't control what they decide to believe. No matter how persuasive, no matter how much they respect you, they can still reject everything you say. That's their freedom, and in Salem, we don't take away a person's freedom or try to force our beliefs down their throats." "I'm not forcing anything," said Perrin calmly. "You're holding them hostage. Do you realize that?" Shem nearly wailed, but kept his voice down so it wouldn't drift over to the fort, where the lieutenants were studying. While it's certainly not back-breaking labor in a dreary mind, but instead reading books in a beautiful setting, they are still being forced. So how is this different than the others you stole out of the world? Perrin demanded, like Wallachia. He was out to kill your children and mother-in-law, Shem told him. We had to steal him away to avoid him murdering your family. But these lieutenants merely wandered too far, and we could have diverted them back without them ever knowing about us, but no, you insisted otherwise. So tell me, what contingency do you have in place should one or both of them decide to go back to Edge? They won't. Perrin was full of confidence. They will stay. Already you've decided their fate, Shem scoffed. No, I promise. They'll want to stay once they fully understand. What they will understand may not be anything you want them to. You may not think you're forcing their minds, but your mind is already made up. There's no alternative for them. Perrin's shoulders sagged. I suppose you had a few in the world who didn't want to listen? All the time, Shem said. More failures than we like to remember, and quite recently, in fact. I didn't want to tell you. His voice quieted. But we've had a former rector and some scouts trying to reach Deck's aunt, uncle, and cousin in Mount Scene. We were hoping they might be able to come join us. That'd be fantastic, Perrin said. Deck would have family and... Realizing that Shem didn't share his enthusiasm, Perrin asked, What's happened? They won't even talk. Seems his Uncle Halling spent some time discussing things with Roran Jordan after the incident, before Gary was sent to Sands. Our man was moving very slowly with the Briders and mentioned that sometimes we're fed incorrect information. Well, my name came up and... When Shem didn't continue, Perrin winced. Didn't go so well? Halling Brider said he'd kill me in a heartbeat for causing his nephew's death, Shem whispered. His wife Lilla and son Atlee were just as bitter. There was no hope of opening their minds, at least not yet. We'll try again in a year or two for Deck's sake, but just don't tell him, Perrin, Shem pleaded. We may never have any success with them, and I don't want Deck getting his hopes up. Disheartened, Perrin said, Understood. Is it really? Shem's gaze turned sharp. Is it understood that some people will refuse to see a light, even if it's shining in their eyes? People will believe what they want to believe, Perrin. A mind forced against its will is not compliant. It's just waiting to rebel. Perrin grabbed his shoulders. But not today. This will all work out, Shem. Trust me. Someone cleared his throat by the doors. Gentlemen, perhaps keep your voices down a bit, please. The valley echoes, you know. Sorry, Winter, Perrin said to his appointed teacher of the lieutenants. He brightened up, though. So tell Shem what you think. How are the lieutenants responding? Go ahead, be honest. Shem watched Winter closely. The surgeon fidgeted. Honestly, I wish Vartia were here, because he's the only other current scout who served as long as I had in the world, and I'd like his opinion about the integrity of these boys, but... He hesitated as he eyed the two men, eagerly awaiting his evaluation. But I think there's potential, great potential. Afra's like a child in a sweet shop, and Raiden has impressed me with his sincerity. He feels disaffected by the world, and he wants a remedy for what aches his soul. Perrin beamed. Spoken like a true doctor. But Shem merely said, Uh-huh. The glare he aimed at Winter suggested he'd just been betrayed. Winter shrank a little under Shem's gaze and shrugged at Perrin, his new ally. I don't know what else to say, General. Say that you think my approach has merit, Perrin said cheerfully, because I think you're right in what you told me earlier. It doesn't do enough to just heal a body. You have to heal the spirit. And that's what we're doing for Raiden and John. So when we reintroduce ourselves next week... Next week! Shem exclaimed. That's too soon. They'll be thrilled to go to Salem because they'll want to see what other surprises are in store, Perrin declared, just as I enjoyed all the surprises. Ha! Shem threw his hands in the air. No, you did not. Your memory is as impaired as your judgment. On our first holy day here, you were ready to strangle me. Or don't you remember losing your temper just before Glees appointed you as our general because you were frustrated with all of the surprises? But Shem, Winter ventured cautiously, remembering the story about these two men getting in a fight in a stable years before and destroying most of it. And while Winter loved pulling out his stitching needle, the lieutenants were using the surgery area as a schoolroom right now. I think General Shin might be right here. Afra, I have no doubt about. I can feel his heart already. I know your worry is about Raiden, but I find him very focused, and he asks such deep and probing questions. He's even taking notes. Which is exactly, Shem rounded on him, how someone who wants us to think he's willing to join us would behave. Perrin rolled his eyes. And how would he behave if he really was sincere about everything? Huh? Shem hesitated. The same way, he had to admit. There you go, said Perrin certainly. Believe the best about him. That's Salem's way, right? But he's not a Salemite, Shem fumed. One of the first things I learned in the world is to expect the worst from everyone. Why are you so skeptical, Shem? Perrin asked, his own patience growing as brittle as Shem's. Because I spent 17 years in the world, Perrin, and by your side. You taught me to be skeptical. And you're supposed to be teaching me about being a Salemite, Perrin countered. Winter exhaled in what he hoped was a calming manner. Voices, gentlemen, echoes, narrow valley. Perrin and Shem glared at each other, so sure of their own ideas that eventually they said at the same time, Just trust me. Winter, shaking his head, walked out of the stables. The lieutenants were a much calmer, safer set of men to supervise. And that's the end of that long chapter. Thank you.